So good morning, everybody. I am the Reverend Tina Dio. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the minister here, and I'm going to introduce Amaya Coblentz, who is giving our special forum talk this morning. You might also see me in pajamas. We did have a Polar Express-themed service, so this is why. And other folks are dressed appropriately as well in their PJs. So, Amaya Coblentz is going to present to us today, and she grew up in our church. She is a graduate student in the Environmental Studies Department at Western Washington University, and she will speak on her year-long inquiry into water in New Mexico and the acequia system. And her talk is titled Landscapes of Change, Acequias, Community Resilience, and State Power in Northern New Mexico. So let us warmly welcome Amaya back to your church. Yay!
Thank you, Reverend Tina, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. I'm so excited to be back here in my home congregation and speaking with all of you about research that I'm super passionate about. So like Reverend Tina said, my name is Amaya Coblentz. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a graduate student up in the Environmental Studies Department at Western Washington University. I also completed my undergraduate degree there, and I studied geographic information science, and for my senior capstone project, I completed a year-long inquiry into our local acequia system, and I titled it Landscapes of Change, Acequias, Community Resilience, and State Power in Northern New Mexico. So I'm excited to talk to you all about that today. For my talk today, I will take us on a little bit of a journey. I'd first like to start by acknowledging my positionality as a researcher in this subject area. I'd like it to be very clear that I've never lived on an acequia system, and I'm not a member of one right now. But I thought it was really important, as someone who was born and raised in New Mexico, to complete and conduct an inquiry into this system that is so culturally and historically important to our region. But I'd like it to be clear that everything that I talk about today has been learned from literature, reading, talking to people. None of it is lived experience, and I'm still learning and growing with all of you in this room, and I'm open to questions, comments, recommendations, etc. I'd also like to make it clear that when I originally completed this project, the intended audience were people who lived in Washington State, very different than here. So a lot of my talk today will be going over a little bit about the physical geography of New Mexico, also talking about our cultural history, giving a context to the acequia system, etc. Some of you may feel very comfortable with this information and may feel like it's a bit of a review, but I think it's really important to talk about it as it is a big basis and the fundamental part of my project. So today I'll be talking a bit about, I'll be starting with water in general, concepts of water, how we view water. I'll then talk about New Mexico and its acequia system, make sure we have kind of a general understanding in this room. I'll then talk about my personal capstone project, Landscapes of Change, and then I will go into a little bit about further research and where I'm going in the next 2 years with my master's degree. So let's go ahead and get started. So sorry. Okay. Perfect. So when I say the word water, a few different things might come to your mind. You might think water is something physical, an economic resource. You might think of just the molecules H2O. You might think that it's a spiritual entity, something that brings life to the desert. Maybe you think that it has inherent value, or maybe you think that the only value comes from what water brings, what we can grow from it. And every single one of you in this room has a different conceptualization of what water is and what it means to you. And depending on your place, on the landscape you grew up, where you live now, your positionality, your view of water is going to be different than the person next to you, different from the community down the road from us, different from a different state, different from those in Washington. And so I'd like us to keep that in mind as we go through this talk today, that depending on where you are in the context of who you are, your view of what water is going to be different. And some of you, when I say the word water, you might immediately think of the water cycle. A physical substance, water, goes through the surfaces of the earth, it evaporates into clouds, it precipitates down back to the surface of the earth, recharges groundwater, and completes this cycle. But I'd like to challenge that a little bit today, and I want to introduce to you a concept that we call the hydrosocial cycle. And so unlike the hydrological cycle, this asserts that water doesn't just flow through biophysical entities on the Earth. This claims that water flows through the interaction amongst human practices, hydrologic technologies, biophysical elements, socioeconomic structures, and cultural political institutions. So water doesn't just flow through our trees, the clouds, the oceans, the rivers, but it also flows through power and culture and money. And so I ask you to think about today as we go through this talk, who gets water? Who has rights to water? And who gets to produce knowledge about water? So now that we've established a little bit about water conceptually, I'll talk just a bit about New Mexico and its acequia system to make sure we have a general understanding in this room about New Mexico and this water system. So as many of you know, New Mexico is a state down here in the southwestern part of the US. And again, I'll remind you, I gave this talk to Washington, so I had to kind of make sure they knew about our state. But New Mexico is west of the 100th meridian, meaning that it is incredibly dry. And most agricultural techniques out here in the west require some sort of irrigation techniques. This is a map that I made of average annual precipitation here in the west. As you can see here in New Mexico, we are sitting in about the 1.5 to 13.3 inches of precipitation per year. And so a very arid landscape down here, we must rely pretty much entirely on irrigation techniques to grow food. And then up where I gave this talk, they are sitting in about the 66 to 187 inches of precipitation every year. So when I was conducting this project, I thought it was really important to emphasize and get across how different our concept of water is to people who have so much precipitation and surface water up there in the Northwest. So here in New Mexico, our surface water comes from about 5 main rivers. We have the Rio Grande, the San Juan, the Canadian, the Pecos, and the Gila. And historically, throughout time, most settlements have hugged these rivers and their tributaries because settlement and communities relied entirely on proximity to water. So as a little bit of a cultural and historic history of New Mexico, I'll remind you all that we have several iterations of power in this region. For many, many years, historically, this land has been home to the ancestral Puebloan groups, as well as migratory indigenous peoples. And these peoples had different ways of controlling and managing water as well. We then have a really culturally important iteration of power with the Spanish colonial period, which begins in about 1598 and lasts until about 1821. And this was a very important and defining period of history in our state. This was a violent and oppressive conquest for natural resources. The Spanish came up through Mexico into this territory and established a lot of settlements via land grants in this area. When Mexico gained independence from Spain in about 1821, this region was under Mexican control until about 1848, and then it became under the control of the United States in about 1912. It became an official state of the Union. I mention all of this history because it's really important to recognize the cultural layering that we have in this area. With every iteration of power, there came a different water code and different claims to the water. So we have a tangled mess of different people having land grants and claims to the water that New Mexico is still trying to untangle to this day. So it's important to keep in mind. And I didn't put the bullet points, but there we go. So through all of these different iterations of settlement and colonization, a simple fact remained between all of them, and that is a land so arid by nature simply requires the diversion of water to communities. And I'd like to make it really clear that as I talk about the acequia system today, I am not suggesting that the Spanish brought with them the idea of water management and control. In fact, indigenous groups of the area utilized things like check dams and irrigation canals some 500 years before the Spanish ever came to the area. So it's not that the Spanish brought with them this idea of water management. But what they did bring with them was an already established political and cultural legal framework that is called the acequia system that we still have to this day. So what is an acequia? An acequia is a human-made irrigation canal, otherwise known as a ditch, that diverts agricultural water from a spring, a river, or a stream to an agricultural field with the purpose of irrigation. This is a really good example of humans intentionally modifying the landscape because it immediately expands almost exponentially the possible irrigable area of the valley. So this is a diagram of what an acequia in a small mountain community might look like. This is the stream from the mountains that runs through the center of the community. The diversion dams are built here at the very top of the stream, closest to the mountains, and so we know that elevation goes from high up here to low down here. The diversion dams are built, and the acequias are dug on either side of the stream. And as you can see here, instead of only being able to irrigate right here next to the stream, once the acequias are built, you've immediately expanded the possible irrigable area to the entirety of the valley. So this has made bigger settlements possible when these were brought over. And the acequia works via gravity flood irrigation. So each member of the acequia gets a certain time to water their fields, and we start here at the very top of the diversion dams. This member will water their field, then they will close their head gate. The next member is able to open their head gate, and the water flows down via gravity down the valley. So as I'm speaking about my project today, and if you took a look at my paper, when I use the term acequia, it can actually refer to two different things. On one hand, it can refer to the physical ditch. It refers to anything having to do with that ditch, the head gates, the hand-dug canal, and any other infrastructure in the ditch. It also refers to the political system that governs the water that's within that system. And there are a few different roles for members who live on the acequia. And if you live on the acequia and you have water rights, you're expected to serve as one of these roles. The first is just the parciante. These are members of the association who pay for water rights. There are also elected commissioners who are elected officials who assist the mayordomo, and they also serve as kind of a communication liaison between the community and parciantes on the ditch and people in the state, so governmental entities. We also have an elected official known as the mayordomo, could also be referred to as the mayordoma, depending on if it's feminine or masculine person. And this is an elected official who allocates the water to parciantes, and they are also in charge of keeping track of oral and paper history of that specific acequia. These acequias are really good examples of what we like to call water democracies. So unlike other private use resources in the States, water in the acequia is not just granted purely by a parciante paying their fee for their water. They're also expected to contribute in a multitude of ways back to the community. And these contributions include participating in ditch cleaning days, voting in board elections, and attending annual meetings. To this day, there's approximately 700 to 1,000 acequias scattered throughout New Mexico as well as southern Colorado. And as you can see here, they all hug different tributaries and rivers in New Mexico. And this is because settlement was completely reliant, of course, on proximity to water in the early days. These are some pictures that I took of acequias during my project. On the left, it's a little bit dark, but I'll point it out. This is a head gate, so this is what a parciante would open when it's time for their field to be flooded with water. And this on the right is what an acequia might look like. It's about 2 to 3 feet across, and the length is as long as it takes to get water from the stream or river to someone's field. I like to point out that these ditches are pretty much entirely hand dug, and it takes a lot of really detailed, intricate work to make sure that the acequia remains clear of any roots or other vegetation that would clog water from getting to one's field. The acequia, since the beginning of time, has been incredibly important and central to small communities in New Mexico and southern Colorado. This is a picture of the acequia system in Dixon, New Mexico. This is a 3D map that's on the side of the community food co-op, if any of y'all have ever been out there. And it shows just how central the ditch and the acequia is to these communities. You can see all of these little lines in here. This is the acequia madre, or the mother ditch, and then all of the lines are shown on the clay map, as well as people's irrigation fields. On the sides of the map are other important buildings, like the community church and the co-op, showing how central the acequia is to the community, that it's literally in the center and it connects everyone in that community to one another. So after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, New Mexico existed in a territorial period for a long time. In the early 1900s, New Mexico wanted to prove to the US that it was worthy enough to become a state. So in 1905, and then again in 1907, New Mexico established a state water code that matched that of the rest of the western states. And it also created what we call the Office of the State Engineer, or the OSE. And this office is created to track all of the water claims in the state, and it transfers power over any water to the office of one centralized expert. In this way, we know that the government created this because they wanted to be able to virtually see all of the water and its users, so that it could enable economic growth and settlement and ensure that all the water claims in the state were being used to their most efficient purpose. The United States, when it was creating this, had this general view that local water control was inefficient and wasteful because flood irrigation was not the most efficient way to create agriculture, and they wanted to be able to track all the claims in the state so that they could potentially make more efficient the agricultural purposes in New Mexico. When this was happening, we have kind of two different opposing views of state power in New Mexico. On the one hand, the state feels as though they are simply mapping and accounting for all of the water in the state because it's a scarce resource. They wanted to ensure that it was being used as efficiently as possible so that they could adequately promote economic growth and development. To the state, this is a seemingly objective and apolitical situation. They're simply mapping out claims to the water and ensuring that it's being used efficiently. However, on the other hand, because of our historic and cultural layering in this state, the locals in a lot of these rural communities have a long history of agencies taking away resources from them. For example, in the transition from Mexican to United States rule over this area, a lot of land grants that were recognized by the Spanish and the Mexican governments went unrecognized by the United States, and many people lost their land, and it was turned to federal land. So in this way, there tends to be a fundamental distrust in governmental agencies in a lot of these small rural communities, which is really important to consider when we think about mapping out water. There's also a well-documented fear of a dismantling of a really culturally important Hispano moral and communal economy of water that we have here in New Mexico. And there's also a concern that creating an office of a centralized expert who can have control over all water in the state could sever ties between the community and the landscape. If the state is able to move water to places that need it, like urban areas, there's a worry that that severs a connection to the landscape. So now that we've had a little bit of kind of a history lesson, a little chat about acequias, etc., I'll talk about my project next. So as a student up in Washington, I was really interested in the field of water resource research. And I also knew that we had this really important and special kind of system of water management here in New Mexico. And I really thought that it was important to learn as much as I could about this so that I could tell the people in Washington about this special state and this type of management that we have. And so I decided for my senior capstone project, I would complete an inquiry into this system. And basically, Landscapes of Change is an exploration of the interaction between community water management and state power. I had two goals when going into this project. The first was that I really just wanted to gain a better understanding of the acequia system, which I had grown up near but not on. And I also really wanted to explore threats that I knew could be problematic for it. I wanted to explore the threats of state power as well as drought on this system. So to do this, over the course of 1 year, I conducted a pretty extensive literature review of water in New Mexico. I interviewed members of acequias, used a method of qualitative coding to analyze transcripts from those interviews, and then I sorted quotes into themes using that method of coding. So for my interviews, I interviewed a pretty small sample size, but it was only a year. I interviewed 7 people who lived on acequias. 6 were paseantes and 1 was a mayordomo. I went to their properties when possible because I thought it was really important to be actually on the landscape. I wanted to walk around their properties, see the ditch, see the head gates, have them walk me around their fields, and kind of get a feeling for what it would be like living on an acequia. I started with a list of questions that was the same for every single respondent, and then I let conversation flow naturally. One of my questions was, what about this acequia system do you think people in Washington who know nothing about it should know? So oftentimes that took the conversation off in different directions, and I really felt like letting the conversation flow naturally was important to understand what they wanted me to know. I then transcribed the interviews onto a digital platform and completed myself a method of qualitative coding where you sort quotes into themes that you find reflected in the literature. So that method of coding comes from the Coding Manual for Qualitative Researchers by Johnny Saldana, and in that book, Saldana asserts that a code is most often a word or a short phrase that symbolically assigns a summative, salient, essence-capturing, and/or evocative attribute for a portion of language-based or visual data. Whew. Basically, what that means is a code is a word or two words that explains an idea that you see in the interviews. So I created a long list of codes. You can see the full list of codes in my paper if you want to check it out. But these are 3 examples of codes that I created for my transcriptions. We have things like measurements of water, beneficial use, and interactions with neighbors. For example, if I coded something under measurements of water, it would be any sort of text that referenced things like acre feet, how much water costs, cubic feet per second, anything along those lines would go under the code measurements of water. I then assigned every single code a different color and then read through my transcriptions and highlighted sentences and words that matched the codes that I put them in, if that makes sense. Once I coded all of my transcriptions, I printed them out and I physically cut every single sentence out with scissors. I then put all the codes into their color coordinating boxes and then sorted those into 3 main themes that I had seen in the literature. Those themes are 1, acequias existing as a physical and political institution, 2, threats to the acequia system, and 3, resiliency. My first theme, acequias existing as both a physical and a political institution, was quickly, in all my interviews, quickly established. Respondents often shared with me that the acequia refers to both a physical ditch, and they described to me that they all have a mutual understanding of shared responsibilities. For example, the mayordomo and the commissioners are elected democratically, and members are expected to attend annual meetings and participate in ditch cleaning days. The acequia as a political institution, respondents also described how the acequia was often the only form of government in the early days in these small unincorporated communities, and it really shaped members' daily lives. It's still central to this day, and oftentimes when members had water conflicts or disputes in their communities, they would go to the acequia board to solve those through that institution. My second theme were threats to the acequia institution. I found 3 threats in my interviews, the first being drought and climate change, the second being state power, and the third, a loss of traditional knowledge. So thinking about climate change, this was a big worry for me. I came into this process expecting respondents to be pretty concerned about the possibility of climate change and severe drought. So by 2050, it's been projected that the Southwest will average conditions experienced during some of our most severe historical droughts. And because acequias rely pretty much entirely on surface water, they're at pretty high risk if the surface water supply diminishes. I was a little bit surprised by respondents when I asked them this question. Most did not seem drastically worried about the threat of drought or climate change. Most felt pretty confident in equitable allocation and were more interested in pursuing more efficient ways of watering their fields. For example, this respondent is talking about their garden, and they were describing to me that they were beginning to use drip systems and drip tape instead of old-fashioned furrows and flood irrigation, because using drip systems and drip tape is about 1/3 the less water than they would use with old-fashioned flood irrigation. The second threat that I asked respondents about was state power. So when I asked about state power, respondents were also a little bit more ambivalent than I expected to this threat. They recognized often that the state, while they have historically been quite a hindrance, they can also be very helpful in our modern time today. For example, this respondent described to me that the only issue they really have with the state is with the Santa Fe County and state interference. They say that they can be very beneficial because they provide funding and improvements, but sometimes they cause a few problems when they just decide to shut off the water. So although some people did express that there was some problems with state governance, it was a little bit less often than I thought it would be in my interviews. The third threat that I was interested in was a loss of traditional knowledge. And of the 3 threats that I was looking at, this was most definitely the most important to most people that I talked about. In this way, Parciantes expressed worry that new generations, such as their children or their children's children, were beginning to have lack of interest in this historic method. They were moving away, and they weren't learning the traditional ways of the acequia system. This respondent says the reality of it is that they're the last of their cousins that live in the area. Everyone else had moved away, and so they don't know if they're the last of the dying breed, is what they said, or if they have to pass it on to their kids. So through all my interviews, this threat was the most worrisome to most of my respondents, because if people move away and don't learn the traditional ways of managing water, the acequia system is at a risk. The third theme that I recognized was resilience. So through all of these threats, the one thing that was consistent between all of my respondents was that they were sure in the resiliency of the acequia system. Historically, the close locus of control of the acequia system, the fact that it's the highest, most diversion in the system in the mountains, allows adaptability to seasonal changes, although this might be changing as things like snowpack lowers going into the future. With that being said, though, the acequia system has persisted for hundreds of years through many different historic droughts, surviving because of community cooperation and a mutual understanding of survival. One of my favorite quotes from my respondents was about resilience, and I'll read it to you. They said, "The acequia systems are 400 plus years old and demonstrate a very democratic, self-regulated system that is fair and is a very water-conserving method of supporting small individual farms. The Parciantes are all in agreement that when water is scarce, all must suffer to make the best of it. It is a legacy that needs to be preserved, but a lot of families in the system are not continuing the family farm tradition. As a result, there is a loss of understanding and cooperation in some areas." So why does this matter? I'm a little biased, but I think this research is absolutely crucial moving into the future. Especially in the field of acequia research and water resources, acequias are important to keep alive and to continue researching and spreading information about because they have several different important aspects to them. For example, acequias exist as an incredibly important cultural and historic systems that are tied to the landscape and very important to our culture as New Mexico. They also serve often underrepresented and rural communities, and they have very powerful legal respect in the New Mexico system, and so they're important to keep alive so that these communities have that power still. They also most likely expand riparian habitat and most likely help to recharge the groundwater, which is super important as our growing development in cities rapidly deplete our groundwater sources. They also provide a model for climate resilience and successful commons management that we can look to as we move into a future with less surface water. And lastly, acequia justice goes hand in hand with food sovereignty movements because oftentimes those who use acequias use them for subsistence farming or their local gardens, and it's really important to put the power back into these local food sovereignty movements. So now that I've gone over a little bit about my project and the results that I found, I'll talk just a little bit about further research and where I'm going in the next 2 years as a master's student. So for the next couple years, I'll be zooming out just a little bit from specifically the acequia system, zooming out to a little bit bigger of general New Mexico water management. And I'll also be attempting to connect some of this research to theory in the in geography. One question that I'm really interested in is looking into how America's understanding of expertise in water science has served as a mode of dispossession in New Mexico specifically. So as a little bit of a teaser to my future research, in 1889, the United States Geologic Survey, or the USGS, built their very first stream gauge here in New Mexico in Embudo, at a very unassuming bend of the Rio Grande. And that is the location where they had what they called Camp Embudo. And they took about 12-ish Eastern United States trained hydrologists, they sent them to Embudo, New Mexico, and they trained them on how to be hydrologists. Basically, the rivers in the east are very different than the rivers here in the west. Here in the west, they are fast-flowing, they're shallow, we have sediment on the bottom, and they change dramatically over the course of the year. So as the US was expanding westward, they realized they really needed to train hydrologists in western rivers. So they sent these hydrologists to Camp Embudo, trained them all up in about a year, Who knows how effective that was? And then they sent them all out to be head hydrologists in the other western states. This is a picture of someone doing some hydrologic training over a river in Embudo, and this is the location of where that camp was. And this is the location of the first USGS stream gauge. So I'll remind us again of the hydrosocial idea. And to bring us back, a hydrosocial territory is a socially, naturally, and politically constituted space that is created and recreated through interactions amongst humans, institutions, and water. So a hydrosocial territory can be an acequia, it can be the Camp Embudo, it could be New Mexico as a whole. And these hydrosocial territories are shaped by what we call a politics of truth, which legitimates certain water knowledges, practices, and governance forms and discredits others, therefore shaping rules, rights, and organizational structures. So thinking about the idea of hydrosocial territories, I'm really interested in two possible research questions. The first would have to do with tracking the spread and production of knowledge from Camp Embudo and how it differed from traditional water knowledge, tracking how those hydrologists went out to the other western states and spread this sort of water knowledge. And second, I'm really interested in how the prioritizing of outside expertise, which ignores, of course, the importance of local and land-based knowledge, affects communities and water rights, possibly in the form of water disputes in local communities. So today we've explored water in New Mexico, a little bit of a history of New Mexico, the acequia system, state power, and outside expertise. I've taken you through my capstone project, Landscapes of Change, and I've scratched the surface on things that I'm interested in studying in the future. This landscape and this water is incredibly important to me, and thank you so much for listening to me talk about it, my project, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments that you all have. Thank you. So we have a little question microphone. I see one in the back. We can go ahead and start with you, Jamie.
Hello. Very good talk. Very fun. So you saw a lot of exodus from these systems of like the younger generations and a loss of traditional knowledge. I'm curious if you saw any influx of new families that want to join these systems that are interested in kind of, you know, re-uptaking the subsistence farming techniques.
Absolutely, that is a really great question. And I saw this in a few of my interviews, not enough for it to have been like its own threat. But one of the problems with an influx to these communities is people from other states in the United States moving into a small rural community and automatically assuming that if they pay for water, they will get water back. However, we have a little bit of a complicated water claims history in the States, and if you buy a parcel of land, if you don't have the water claims along with that land, you don't have rights to the acequia or the water that runs by the land. And so a lot of people will show up to acequia meetings or not even show up at all and expect to have that water without contributing back to the community. And it's causing a little bit of kind of a break in the communal connection of that acequia, if that makes sense. So that is a little bit of a threat as well.
So one of my favorite films was the Milagro Beanfield War. And so my question has something to do with that kind of conflict. And for those who don't know, this big resort building thing came in, and there was a dispute of rights of who gets the water and whatever. It's a very incredible, wonderful movie. But what my question is then, how much is the threat of outside big money? And I know that somehow that's controlled by government in a way, but big money is so attractive. Is that a real problem here, or is that just a wonderful movie?
That is most definitely a real problem. Maybe one of the biggest threats that these acequia systems face, because a lot of these acequias are used for subsistence farming. Some are used to grow things like alfalfa to put onto the market. But in the eyes of the state, oftentimes they prioritize development, so the development of cities or large-scale agriculture, and because that is more economically efficient for the market, part of the issue of state power is the idea that once the state can see all claims to the water, they may decide that it's more efficient to move water from one basin to another, maybe down to Albuquerque or Las Cruces, and that would take water away from local communities. Yes, so development and the market is a huge threat.
Hi.
Hi.
Let's see. I'm a Parsante. I'm a commissioner, and I agree with all what you've said today. I do have land up in Truchas, and I'm part of a 3-ditch system, or our family is on a 3-ditch system. And all my kids, Nathan, Paul, Noah, and Maria, have all participated in the ditch cleaning off and on. Now they're grown up. I got one in Seattle, one in Denver, one in Chicago, and one in Los Alamos. Yes, there is a fear of my family losing that knowledge. They did grow up with it, and I worry about the loss of knowledge. So I'm just concerned with your points. I agree, and also the other thing that has hit me, because we're in it right now, is we have a suit against us, all the waters in northern New Mexico. Well, specifically tied to Oque-Wingay and Santa Clara. They want the water for economic development, casinos, golf courses. So I see that as a big problem for our system. And of course, drought is a big issue nowadays. And we are all working on trying to come up with solutions. But I hear you loud and clear.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I didn't even get into adjudication. I know that's a big word. I took it out of my presentation because I only had so much time. But most definitely, yes.
Talk about the geography of acequias. You said New Mexico and southern Colorado. Is there anywhere in the West that, or does everyone have their other, like if you go north, you get more snow, and if you go west, you have...
Yeah, so New Mexico and southern Colorado are pretty much generally the only places where this acequia system has continued on to this day. There were other irrigation systems and acequia systems in the Southwest a long time ago, but because of the topography of New Mexico, as well as early on protective legal factors, acequias have survived to this day here because they were written into codes early on in settlement.
Are they still used in other places, like in Spain, or, you know, I guess it started with the Moors?
Yes,
and
it
like
started
the history,
with the Moors, and then the Spanish took it up in Spain, and then it was brought over to Mexico, and then up through the North America. And it is used in other places, but not to the same extent, because, for example, in Spain, most of their rivers have been dammed and is completely under government control, unlike rivers here.
So is it one of these like UNESCO intangible cultural thing? Is that something that people talk about?
Would
I guess
you
it would be
care to
tangible.
explain more?
Well, you know, sorry. Yeah, like as a protection or as a, I'm trying to think what else, you know, some of the historic cities and things around the world or technologies that people use.
Yes, and specifically there are lots of programs in New Mexico that are doing really great work to preserve this system and preserve oral history. For example, there's a Mayordomo project which trains young people in these communities on how the acequia works. And the problem really is when it comes down to it and water is unavailable, will the acequias be important enough to the state government to protect them, is the ultimate question.
Other questions? I have a question, and I'm just a little curious more about some of the pre-Spaniard methods of the indigenous methods, and like have some of those held on as well? I don't know if...
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you for raising that. So before Spanish settlement, indigenous groups here had really intricate ways of irrigation as well, such as terrace farming and things along those lines, where they would dig irrigation canals that would flood fields like terrace farming. When Spain brought over the acequia system, it was a little bit more well adapted to permanent community life. And so both indigenous groups and Hispanic groups kind of adopted acequia systems, and they've evolved through both to this day, if that makes sense. So after the Spanish came here, the systems started to kind of co-evolve to what they are to this day, yeah.
I'm going to ask permission. Can I ask the question I asked you this morning?
Sure.
Straw dog question. It sounds like this coding method takes a lot of time and effort and thought. Did you consider using AI to summarize and come up with your themes?
That's a really good question. So, thank you for asking that. Of course, there is a consideration, and there are pros to using AI in this type of coding when you have a lot of interviews. However, I hope to never use AI to do this type of research. Something that's really important to qualitative research is that the researcher or the interviewer takes into account their positionality and who they are in the research, which an AI bot cannot do. And part of this research is reading everything that you can, understanding situational context and history, and seeping yourself in that history. So as I did my interviews and transcribed them, I took into account things that I know, things about the time period, things that I know about growing up here, things from visiting the people on their properties, and I let that all simmer into an analysis, taking into context value-based judgments, history of power in this area, to create this analysis of my interviews. An AI bot will simply sort into themes, things that match each other, and spit them out to you, and most likely won't have that same sort of simmering value judgment call that a researcher would.
How did you find or meet your interviewees?
Yeah, so I'm going to shout out someone in the audience. I worked for Manesh Bakrania, forest photography business for a long time, and we've done a lot of work in different areas of New Mexico, and he knows so many people. So one of the first things I did was just ask, like, do you know of anybody? We also have family friends that live on Acequias, and then I used what's called just the snowball research effect, where I ask the person I'm interviewing, do you know of anyone else who would be interested in doing a short interview? And then they would connect me, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you for this fascinating talk.
Thank you.
I've been sort of mulling over, wondering about gender roles. You mentioned mayor domo, mayor doma, and I'm wondering how common it is for there to be gender diversity in the roles or not.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm honestly probably not the best person to answer it since I interviewed only 7 people. I only ran into female mayordomas in the literature, and then one interviewee talked about it. So historically, it's been a male position, and only about recently has it been a little bit more flexible in who is to work as an elected official. But I believe that throughout New Mexico there have been female mayordomos, there have been white mayordomos, et cetera, and it doesn't have to be one specific type of person. Yeah. Oh, there's a microphone coming for you.
Just to follow up on that, this is largely a Catholic community, which has been male-dominated in terms of, so I wonder if culturally that's part of the background.
Yes, thank you for sharing. I do think so, absolutely, yeah. And I went through my project very fast, so yeah, if anything was confusing, I will clear it up for you, absolutely. Please don't be shy about questions.
Cool. Anything? Thank you, Amaya, again. Thank you so much. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
And when you finish your next project, we'll have you back.
I'll let you know what I do.
Say again.
I'll let you all know what I do.
Cool.
Come talk about it.
So yes, thank you all for coming, and I'm sure Amaya's around to mingle with folks here, so thank you.